Welcome to Under the Surface. This is where we slow down and look at the patterns underneath the stories we tell ourselves. Today's chapter is called We Are Not Normal. Now what? And underneath the idea of normal is often exhaustion. The exhaustion of performing, adapting, shrinking, and trying to fit into a version of life that never truly felt honest. Most people are not struggling because they are broken. They are struggling because they spent years trying to become someone easier for the world to understand. Welcome to No One Is Normal, the podcast where real stories remind us that none of us are alone. You can also visit the website www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co for resources, updates, and future podcast episodes. I am Brad H. Hill, and each week we talk about the messy, the complicated, and the deeply human moments that shape us and remain in our memories. I am not here to tell anyone how to live. I am here to offer the stories, the insights that made me realize that no one is normal, including me, because healing starts when self-honesty begins. Some realizations do not arrive gently. They hit like a jolt, sudden, undeniable, and almost offensive in how obvious they feel once they finally land. For me, one of those moments came when I stopped arguing with myself and admitted something I had spent years trying to outrun. I am not normal, not in the polished, predictable, easy to explain way that society loves to package and reward, not in the neat, orderly version of life that always seemed to make sense for other people, not in the clean progression of milestones that says if you just do A, B, and C, then peace, belonging, and purpose will naturally follow. I spent a lot of years trying to understand what normal looked like so I could imitate it. I watched people. I copied behaviors. I chased the job, the image, the relationship, and the lifestyle I thought would make me feel like I had finally arrived. It never worked. The closer I got to looking normal from the outside, the more disconnected I felt on the inside. I could play the part. I could perform stability. I could build the look of control. But underneath it, I still felt like I was carrying a life that did not fit the mold I kept trying to squeeze it into. For a long time, I treated that like a flaw. I thought the problem was me. I thought if I could just be less intense, less restless, less aware, less scarred, and less complicated, then maybe I would finally settle into some version of life that felt natural. But what if that was never the assignment? What if the problem is not that I am not normal? What if the real problem is how much energy I wasted trying to become something I was never meant to be? What if the very things that made me feel out of place are the same things that helped me survive, rebuild, and tell the truth? What if not being normal is not the setback I thought it was? What if it is the starting point? That is what this episode is about. It is about what happens when you stop chasing someone else's definition of okay and start asking what is true for you. It is about the discomfort of realizing you do not fit the expected template and the freedom that can come once you stop apologizing for that. It is about identity, self-awareness, and the hard truth that sometimes the life that fits you best is the one that looks the least conventional from the outside. If we are not normal, now what? That is the question, and honestly, I think it might be one of the most important questions we can ask. By the time I got to this point in the story, I had already dragged a lot into the light. Addiction, relapse, shame, self-destruction, career mistakes, starting over, letting go of old patterns that once felt like survival. I had also walked alongside Bonnie while she told the truth about almost 30 years of abuse, fear, and survival. So this realization did not come out of nowhere. It was more like something that had been waiting in the background for years, finally stepped forward and said, "Are you done pretending yet?" Once I stopped resisting the truth that I am not normal, a lot of my life started making more sense. Growing up, normal always looked like something happening somewhere else. Other families seemed to have structure, where I saw instability. Other people seemed to move through life with a kind of built-in ease that I could never quite replicate. Even when I got older and became more capable, more accomplished, and more self-aware, that underlying feeling never fully left. I still felt like I was studying how to live rather than naturally living. I was watching how people talked, how they fit, how they carried themselves, and how they moved through relationships, work, and conflict. And I kept trying to reverse engineer whatever they seemed to know instinctively. That became a strategy. I chased jobs that looked respectable. I chased versions of success that made sense on paper. I chased relationships, routines, and identities that I thought would finally make me feel settled. But no matter how close I got to the version that looked right from the outside, something still felt off. It always felt like I was forcing myself into something just because it seemed easier to explain. The harder I tried to fit the mold, the more disconnected I became from who I truly was. For a long time, I made that mean there was something wrong with me. I thought maybe I was too much, too aware, too intense, too restless, or too hard to please. I thought if I could just tone myself down, clean myself up, and become easier for other people to understand, maybe life would finally feel less complicated. But over time, and especially through writing this book and recording these episodes, I started to see something I had missed for years. The same traits that made me feel out of step are also the traits that helped me survive. The awareness that made me anxious in chaotic environments is the same awareness that helps me read people deeply now. The stubbornness that once kept me trapped in destructive cycles is the same grit that helped me claw my way back out. The fact that I never fully fit the standard model is part of why I can connect with people whose stories do not fit it either. That changed the whole question. When I say we are not normal, I am not talking about being broken beyond repair. I am talking about the people whose lives never followed the clean script. Survivors, people in recovery, people who grew up in homes that looked fine from the outside and felt like war zones on the inside. People who have been divorced, shattered, written off, hospitalized, arrested, underestimated, abandoned, or quietly exhausted by trying to live up to something that never fit them in the first place. For people like us, normal was never going to be a straight line. Once I stopped grieving that, I could finally ask something better. If I am not normal, now what? That question is uncomfortable because it removes the script. Once you stop chasing someone else's version of what life is supposed to look like, you are left with a kind of freedom that can feel almost frightening at first. You have to decide what matters without a template, build around your actual values instead of your performance, and stop asking what will make you look acceptable and start asking what will make your life honest. For me, that changed how I look at everything. It changed how I think about work, not just what pays well, but what actually uses my story, my voice, and my instincts, instead of asking me to hide them. It changed how I think about relationships, not just who looks right beside me, but what kind of love feels safe, mutual, and real. It changed how I think about purpose, because I do not want to spend my life quietly carrying all this and pretending it never mattered. I want to use it. I want the scars to mean something. It also changed how I look at failure. When you are obsessed with being normal, failure feels like proof that you do not belong. It becomes something to hide, clean up, and move past as quickly as possible. But once I stopped grading myself against that fake standard, failure started looking more like data. Jobs that burned me out taught me what kind of leader I never want to become. Relapses taught me where I was still lying to myself. Relationships that did not work taught me what I actually need, what I will not tolerate, and how expensive it is to betray myself for the sake of keeping peace. That is the pivot point in this episode. This is where the story stops being just mine. Because you were not meant to be normal. You were meant to be you is not just a line that sounds good. It is the whole assignment. If you are listening to this and you see yourself anywhere in these episodes, This is the moment where I am not just asking you to relate. I am asking you to pay attention. Where have you been twisting yourself into something smaller just to make other people comfortable? Where have you treated your differences like defects instead of clues? Where have you kept chasing a version of life that looks acceptable, but feels dead? Taking a quick pause here. If this episode is resonating, I would love for you to follow the No One is Normal podcast on whatever platform you listen on. Every follow helps this show reach people who might need these stories. Now let's jump back in. At the core, this chapter is about what happens. The second denial cracks, and you tell the truth about who you are and what you have lived through. It is not about becoming reckless, and it is not about turning your life into rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is about finally building something that fits. Human beings are wired to compare. We notice patterns, study other people, and measure ourselves against whatever our environment presents as acceptable, successful, or safe. That starts young. In childhood, we absorb cues about what kind of family is normal, what kind of behavior gets rewarded, which emotions are acceptable, and what parts of ourselves are safer to hide. Social comparison is not automatically unhealthy. It helps us learn. But when comparison becomes identity, it starts to distort the way we see ourselves. Psychology has shown that many people internalize normal as a standard of worth rather than a description of social patterns. That is where the damage begins. If your life is unstable, traumatic, chaotic, isolating, or simply different from what is being presented as healthy, you often absorb that difference as shame. You start to believe that because your life does not match the approved version, there must be something deeply wrong with you. That belief can follow people for years. Neuroscience helps explain why not fitting in can feel so physically uncomfortable. The brain does not only respond to physical danger, it also responds to social threat. Rejection, judgment, exclusion, and deviation from the group can activate stress systems in the body. Social approval tends to feel rewarding. Social misalignment can feel dangerous. That is why authenticity often feels hard at first, even when it is healthier than conformity. Your nervous system may interpret honesty as risk, simply because it is unfamiliar. Behavioral science also shows how repeated conformity can fracture identity. When people suppress their instincts, emotions, values, or interests just to gain approval, they may become more socially acceptable, but less internally whole. Over time, that can show up as depression, resentment, numbness, anxiety, burnout, or a vague feeling of living someone else's life. On the other hand, people who begin acting in alignment with their actual values, even in small ways, tend to develop stronger self-trust, resilience, and long-term psychological stability. You can see this all over real life. Students who do not fit traditional academic molds are often seen as underperformers, when in the right environment, they may be highly intuitive, creative, and capable in ways that standard systems do not know how to measure. Workers who do not conform to standard success narratives may be viewed as unmotivated when they are really trying to build a life that values meaning, health, or autonomy over image. Survivors and people in recovery may feel permanently behind because their timeline does not match the cultural script, when in reality, they are doing some of the hardest work a human being can do. Social media has intensified this whole thing. We are constantly exposed to curated versions of other people's lives, and then silently invited to compare our lived reality to their edited highlight reel. That can make normal feel like something everyone else has already figured out. But if you look closer, what most people are actually craving is not normal. They are craving belonging, safety, meaning, and the freedom to be known without being punished for it. That is why redefining normal matters. If you begin to see normal, not as a fixed standard, but as a social construct, shaped by culture, timing, privilege, and performance, it loses some of its power over you. It becomes something to examine instead of obey. And once you stop organizing your life around fitting in, you can begin organizing it around what is true. That is where individuality stops being a liability and starts becoming a framework. The people who embrace the fact that they do not fit the old mold often become the ones who create new language, new communities, new systems, and new forms of leadership. They tend to become more creative because they had to think differently, more compassionate because they know what it feels like to be outside the circle, and more resilient because they had to build identity from the inside out. So yes, being not normal can hurt, but it can also become the exact thing that frees you. For a long time, I treated normal like it was a destination I had somehow missed. I thought if I could just work harder, make smarter choices, clean up the messier parts of my life, and become more acceptable, then maybe I would finally feel at peace inside my own skin. I did not realize how much of my life was being shaped by that chase until I finally stopped and looked at what it was costing me. A lot of what I was calling ambition or discipline was really performance. I was adjusting my words, my goals, and even the way I related to people around what I thought would make me easier to understand. I was trying to create a life that made sense from the outside, even when it did not feel honest from the inside. That kind of disconnect does not always show up dramatically. Sometimes it looks like functioning. Sometimes it looks like success. But underneath it, there is this steady feeling that something is off. What I finally had to admit is that a lot of that performance was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being seen too clearly, fear that if people knew how complicated, intense, restless, or wounded I really was, they would decide I was too much or not enough. I was not just chasing normal, I was chasing safety. I thought if I could fit the mold, then maybe I would stop feeling exposed. The irony is that the parts of me I tried hardest to tone down are some of the same parts that carried me through. My awareness helped me survive. My intensity helped me keep going. My need to question things is part of what kept me from staying trapped in dead versions of my life forever. Those traits did not make me broken. They made me harder to explain inside a world that prefers simple labels and tidy stories. Accepting that I am not normal did not fix everything. It did not suddenly erase doubt or make life easy. What it did do was remove the fantasy that one day I would finally become some polished version of myself and feel complete. It gave me permission to stop chasing the mold and start paying attention to what is real. That shift changed more than I expected. I do not think healing made me normal. I think healing helped me stop needing that word in the first place. What I want now is not a life that looks acceptable from the outside. What I want is a life that feels honest when I wake up in it. At this point, that matters far more to me than fitting in ever did. If you are listening to this, and something in it feels familiar, that is probably not an accident. Maybe you have spent years feeling just slightly out of step with everyone around you. Maybe you have asked yourself some version of the same question repeatedly. Why can I not just fit? Why does this feel easier for other people? Why do I feel like I am always trying to decode life instead of naturally living it? Those questions are more common than people admit. A lot of people hide the parts of themselves that do not line up with what they think the world will reward. They soften their edges, they mute their instincts, they stay in jobs, relationships, or routines that are slowly killing them because those choices look more acceptable from the outside. They tell themselves that if they can just hold it together long enough, eventually it will feel natural. But sometimes it never does. And that does not mean you failed. It may mean you have been trying to force yourself into a life that does not actually fit. Normal is not fixed. It shifts with culture, timing, family systems, peer groups, and whatever environment you are in. What one place rewards, another place punishes. What one community calls healthy, another calls selfish. If you build your self-worth around those moving targets, you will spend your life exhausted and confused. But if you start looking at your life through your own values instead of arbitrary expectations, something begins to change. You stop asking how to look okay. You start asking how to live honestly. That is not easy. Most of us were trained from early on to compare, perform, avoid judgment, and interpret difference as danger. Letting go of that does not happen overnight. It can feel frightening at first. You may second guess yourself. You may worry about what people will think. That is real. What matters is whether you are willing to notice those pressures instead of automatically obeying them. So I want to ask you something. Where in your life have you been trying so hard to be normal that you have become smaller, quieter, sicker, or more numb? Where are you twisting yourself into something that makes sense on paper but does not feel alive? Where are you treating your differences like defects instead of clues? You do not have to answer all of that today, but you do need to start paying attention. Because the minute you stop worshiping normal, you begin to reclaim yourself. And when that happens, you are no longer just surviving other people's expectations. You are building a life that actually belongs to you. Acknowledging that we are not normal is not about defeat. It is not about limitation. It is not about deciding that because life did not follow the expected blueprint, we are somehow less worthy of peace, love, purpose, or success. It is about clarity. It is about understanding that many of the rules we absorbed were arbitrary, socially reinforced, and never designed to hold the full truth of a human life. Once you see that, you can stop organizing your identity around fitting in. You can start organizing it around what is real. Seeing normal as a lens instead of a label changes everything. It lets you question assumptions instead of living under them blindly. It lets you examine the pressure you have carried, the roles you have performed, and the choices you have made just to feel acceptable. It turns shame into insight. It turns conformity into reflection. It turns difference into information. And from there, you can build. You can choose your values more deliberately. You can act from alignment instead of panic. You can recognize that your path may be unconventional and still be deeply valid. You do not need to fit a mold to be worthy, capable, or successful. You do not need to erase your story to earn belonging. The things you survived, the ways you differ, and the parts of you that never lined up neatly with the script do not disqualify you. If anything, they may be the exact material your real life is meant to be built from. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this. You do not need to become normal. You need to become honest. You need to pay attention to what fits, what does not, what heals you, what numbs you, what pulls you closer to yourself, and what keeps you performing for a world that was never going to save you. That is where freedom starts. That's under the surface. Not to shame the differences, not to force ourselves into a mold, but to understand the patterns that made us believe we had to. If this chapter brought up feelings of isolation, pressure, or the fear that you never quite fit anywhere, you are not alone. Maybe the goal was never to become normal. Maybe the goal was to become honest. Sometimes healing starts the moment we stop asking how to fit in and start asking what actually fits us. Just a reminder, the stories and conversations in this podcast are for informational and personal reflection only. Nothing shared here should be taken as medical, legal, or professional advice. Always speak with a qualified professional about your own personal situation. Thank you for listening to No One Is Normal. If today's message resonated with you, you can find the book No One Is Normal on Amazon and Kindle, and explore more resources at www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co. Remember, you weren't meant to be normal, you were meant to be you.